we'll jump right in. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Just so I know everybody's in the right place, this is Measuring That Matters, Yardsticks for Success. You are here to learn more about measurement and evaluation, just to make sure folks know why we're here. We're here because a couple years ago, the Women's Foundation of Boston and the Red Sox Foundation came together to form the WIN Network, Women in Nonprofit Network. We had this vision to make sure that we could convene and bring together female leaders of nonprofits across the Commonwealth to make sure that they had space to learn, connect, and thrive and grow and collaborate, to make sure they didn't feel alone, which was something that we heard too often from so many leaders of nonprofits in this area. So we are in our seventh conversation to date historically, which is exciting. Hopefully we have 7 more going forward, and hopefully we can return to in-person next year at some point. I'll just say what I do love about WIN, and I'm sure you all feel the same way, is that we're completely driven by our participants. Every theme, every talk, every conversation, we pull our participants, our members, and ask them, what do you guys want to learn about? What do you need? Where are your gaps? And so today's conversation was completely driven by the last event that we had, that survey that we asked you to fill out at the end of the conversation. Those results tell us what you guys want to hear. So today we're here because of what we've heard from you. It's a good also transition to make you all fill out that survey again at the end of today's conversation. It's quick 6 questions. Please fill it out. It will help inform the experts that we bring together next time when we meet to make sure you all are getting what you need to be successful in your role. So today, like I said, we're going to be diving into some of the technical and tactical sides and pieces of measurement and evaluation. What I'm very excited about today is we have 3 content experts, but they all come from different perspectives. And I think that will be truly valuable as we dive into this conversation, because we have individuals that are running nonprofits, individuals that work with small nonprofits, individuals that consult with nonprofits. So you're going to get different angles of approach when we think about what it means to measure and evaluate an organization to success. I did want to make sure, last piece of housekeeping, everyone knows this is being recorded. We will share this on the WIN YouTube channel a few days after this event is over. And most importantly, the Q&A, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, that little button there, that is open for our participants to submit questions. We got a bunch from pre-registered participants, but please feel free to put those in there as we're having this conversation. I will try to do my best to get to all of them. You can also ask direct questions of our expert panelists this morning as well. So like I said, we'll do our best and we'll keep an eye on that, but thank you all again for joining us. That was way too much from me. Now let me turn it over to our panelists. Thank you, ladies, for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us. You know, I always said people can do their own bios better than anybody else can. So we're going to turn the mic over to our panelists. We'll start with Julia to share just a minute or so about who you are and what you do, Julia.
Great, thanks, Becca. It's great to be here and see so many friendly names in the attendee list. Lots of people here who I know from Boston and the region who I've had a chance to work with. My name is Julia Gilman. I am a not-for-profit consultant that specializes in program evaluation and performance measurement. My background comes from human services. I've had the pleasure of working in the human service sector, grew up in the city and got a chance to really get to know the not-for-profit world, went back and got a graduate degree in evaluation, and now really tries to work strongly with community-based organizations to make evaluation practical and reliable, reliant in terms of who the organizations are and what they need. So very much about right sizing, effective strategy, just like Becca was saying, and very hands-on practical work. And I am thrilled to be on this panel with these 2 other amazing specialists in this area. So thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. Marla, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Becca, and thanks for inviting me and having me here. I'm a 20-year veteran at McKinsey & Company, and I have been doing my work in strategy, innovation, digital transformation, and leadership over the years. I've had a really privileged opportunity to ensure that social sector nonprofit, et cetera, has been a core part of my client portfolio, ranging from the World Bank to the Film at Lincoln Center to small nonprofits around the Boston area. And it's been a just huge part of what's given me satisfaction over the years. And within that context, have done some measurement, but also a lot on strategy, innovation, et cetera. And I just came off chairing the board of trustees at Babson College for the last 4 years, where I've had a different element of nonprofit and higher ed in my portfolio. So really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Marla. And Beth.
Hi, nice to be with all of you. I'm Beth Babcock. I'm the CEO of Economic Mobility Pathways, EMPath, and we are an economic mobility action tank that produces coaching tools and processes that are used to help families move out of poverty. We use those tools with our own families here in the greater Boston area, where we coach about 1,300 individuals a year, but we share our tools and processes with a national and now international network of organizations, about 145 or so of them, that also use those coaching tools and processes to improve their own economic mobility work, serving about 350,000 families to date using mobility mentoring, the main platform that we've developed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth. So we're going to jump right into the questions because we have about 730 that came in. Or we could spend hours on this topic. Having run nonprofits myself for the last 15, 20 years, I know this is so critical to an organization's success, growth, scaling, fundraising, everything ties back to sort of how you can prove you're making an impact. So today we'll get into a little bit of the who, what, when, where, and most importantly, why, which is a good transition, I think, to my first question. And Marla, I'd love to start with you. Sort of why even think about measuring and evaluating programs?
I think there's certainly lots of reasons. One is, obviously the donors who are putting their money in are looking to seek what return they're getting from that investment. I'll call it an investment for now. And that, I think, spans many, many different categories, because people are looking for hard metrics. They're also looking for softer metrics along the way. I also think it helps guide internally. I mean, we all hear the phrase, what gets measured gets paid attention to. And that matters also. I do think, and I know we'll talk a little bit later, it's a really tough balance between measuring the right things and over measuring. I see a lot of my clients going into that over measuring category of then the metrics take on a life of their own, as opposed to kind of making sure that you're really keeping sight of the metrics driving the outcomes and the purpose that you want to achieve. And so that's a bit of, it's just something that's hugely important, no matter whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, higher ed, whatever you do. But it really is one of those topics that has a lot of tension and has a lot of balance that leaders really have to manage, and it's not easy.
For sure. And just so everyone knows sort of the format of these questions, I'll try to get one question per panelist, but certainly panelists, as you know, chime in if you have anything to add onto whatever someone has said. And like I said, we have so many to get through, so we're going to try to ping as many as possible. Julia, I'd love to go to you next. That was sort of a why. I'd love you to talk a little bit more about the how. How do you determine what to even measure in a nonprofit?
Well, and I was going to jump on Marla too, so I'm going to quickly respond to the question and then say more about the what. Right. I mean, one of the things about the why that I often say to folks is, while you have to pay attention to what the funders want, it ultimately isn't going to happen if your own staff doesn't see its value to them as well. And so the line that I often like to say is, measure what you value and others will value what you measure, which is that you need to know organizationally what's critical to your mission, to your organization providing the very best services it can, and tracking and measuring the impact of those services on the constituents that you work with. And hopefully that will align with what your funders want. There probably will be times where you have to gather some information that you just don't think is that important because your funder wants it. That's okay, but it shouldn't be. And in the case of particularly small community-based organizations, if you're being driven by the funders and you're not being driven by what's essential to your own internal systems, you're going to be in trouble because you're never going to get it done. Your staff's not going to gather the data that you need. So in terms of the what, I mean, one of my other standard lines is it's most critical that you yourself look back on what you're doing. Some groups are struggling just to gather demographic information. If you can get really good information on who you're serving. For some small community-based organizations, that's a huge step up from where they've been. Ultimately, you have to gather descriptive data, which is who you're serving and what's happening. Then you need to gather process data, which is what's going on, how much people are getting, how frequently are they coming in the door, how much case management, counseling, education, housing services they're getting, before you can get to outcomes. You can't just jump to outcomes if you aren't doing descriptive and process data gathering first, and you need to do that well. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of Beth and what EMPath does, because they gather really good data, and garbage in, garbage out. You need good data to get good outcomes. So that's a really important part of the whole story.
Absolutely. And that's a good transition to you, Beth. And I know in your intro, you spoke about providing people the tools they need, right? So can you speak a little bit about the tools that are necessary in measurement in the evaluation for a program? What are everything from the software to the people, all of it? So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that I agree completely with what Julia just said, that at different stages in organizational development, you have different resources that you can use in the process of trying to measure things to help your organization in its mission. And so I think, first of all, you need to have a clear sense of your own mission and what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
We started out, when I came to EMPath, that was in 2006. Our mission was to help families move out of poverty. And we didn't have any measurement of how many families we moved out of poverty. We didn't even have any measurement of how many families we served, to Julia's point, or anything about the demographics that we could be sure was describing them. So where your organization is, you need to start there and build out. And the first thing is definitely, as Julia said, to develop a capacity to understand who you're serving. Mm-hmm. And the basic characteristics of who you're serving, because you need to know, whether you're touching the market that your mission says you're supposed to touch. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you need to begin to have a sense of, are we doing the work we're supposed to do, which means measuring the mission itself. In our case, were we moving any families out of poverty? Did we have a way of measuring that? Because that was supposedly what the organization did. And then as you get further along in the development of the organization, you begin to look at more closely the work that you're doing and how well the work that you're doing, its processes, as Julia said, are actually producing and connected to the outcomes that you're supposed to be delivering. So do you have a way of monitoring your own work to be sure that your work is doing what it's supposed to do? And that takes a combination. The biggest thing it takes is clarity of vision and clarity of what your organization is and what it's supposed to be doing. And the next thing that you need is you need to have your people, the people in the organization buying into the vision and having a clear sense that the information that you're getting is going to be helping them achieve that vision, and also to be able to share with your funders. And then the last thing is increasingly sophisticated platforms and processes that will allow you to get more efficiently and effectively at the information that your organization needs to be sure that it's going in the mission direction that you say that you want to be going in.
Mm-hmm. Marla, I'm curious if you could speak to, maybe from your experience at Babson, when an organization sort of embarks upon the journey of better measurement and evaluation, I'm thinking about leadership and sort of the communication and those stakeholders invested in measurement and evaluation. In your opinion, where have you seen the best success in terms of who's driving the leadership of the measurement and evaluation? Boards, EDs? Is it your data person? Do you know what I mean? So for all those out there that have maybe 4 people, maybe 40 people, who should be the real stakeholders driving this?
I think it really has to start with the president, CEO of the organization or the nonprofit, because that really is the leadership of the organization. I think then once there's a starting point, right, and we did this at Babson, we had a very long list, then the president and the staff came to the board. And then we really looked at that in a lot of detail and said, well, these are the metrics that are most important for the board to keep track of. The other thing that we did is we took a really hard look at saying, okay, if these are the metrics, what are the decisions that these metrics are going to drive and by when? because just tracking a metric and looking at a pattern is really great, but you need to ask yourself what decisions are going to be made from this data, if it goes up, if it goes down, if it stays flat, and by when. Because it's not necessarily the change in the metrics that surprise us sometimes, it's the timing of them. And sometimes they happen faster or slower. And if you're not prepared in advance to say, okay, if and when this metric hits by this timing, we are going to have a conversation and take a decision on this particular topic. And that then just prepares both the board and the management team in a shared context of what you can expect from that data and those metrics. I guess the only other piece that I would say in this context is, and maybe we can come back to this, is just being really aware of our biases as it relates to data. We think that data is objective, but so much of the research shows that oftentimes contradictory data will make us dig our heels in even further on the other data. And we really need to be aware of those biases of where the data came from, what the data's saying. And the only way to solve for that is by having really good meetings and a really good process that says, do we all agree? If this metric goes up 20%, we're going to be concerned. If enrollment goes down X percent, we are going to be concerned and we're going to have a conversation. And that kind of collaboration across leadership, across the board, across the organization is really important. And the more you can surface those conversations and those biases, the better off you are. Because I can see bias potentially in Beth and Julia, but I can't see it in myself. Been scientifically proven. We've got to work together to address those issues.
Absolutely. Julia, I'd love you, if you have a response, feel free.
Well, go ahead. I'll just do it like I did last time. Respond.
Yeah,
I agree with a lot of what Marla said, and I'll add some other perspectives too. But let me hear your question.
Great. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit, because again, I know I said this, many of our participants listening have smaller shops and just don't have the means and resources to do a full-on, let's hire this external. So for those that might have a limited budget, what do you recommend that a program really focuses on in terms of their measurement and evaluation? Like, how do you get it done with limited dollars?
Well, and that was a natural follow-up from what Marla was talking about, because there's a couple different things. One, I really believe that everybody's biased. I couldn't agree with you more, Marla. And transparency is a key way of articulating that, to understanding that, putting that out there and getting people to all look at the data. Secondly, talking about the board and leadership, understanding who your constituency is and who your data is for. The data you're going to share with your board probably isn't exactly the same data that you're going to reflect on in your monthly staff meetings when you're looking at your demographics. Give an
example.
So a great board metrics would obviously be, how are our enrollments going? Are we hitting our enrollment targets? Yeah. How are our key performance indicators that we've got? And Becca, you and I talked about this when we worked together a million years ago in KPIs at the Scholar Athletes. But what are our KPIs? Are we hitting our high school graduation numbers? Are we hitting our sports participation numbers? Like major quarterly numbers, just like Marla was saying, that you're gonna see fluctuation over time, and the board really wants to track on. And when I say to folks, do a dashboard, I say pick 6 things. 6 things that can fit on and Salesforce is what a lot of my clients are using these days, although Google Sheets and Excel are fine too. Pick your 6 metrics that you're going to see change over a quarter and that are really high functioning, that are strategic, and that's what you share with the board. In your monthly data inquiry team meetings, which are a really critical way that small CBOs and large and mid-size can come together, pick the key questions that you programmatically are interested in. Why are we seeing lower attendance on Thursdays and Fridays than on Monday and Tuesday? Why are we seeing more people coming in from Dorchester when we've been targeting East Boston and we can't get East Boston folks to walk in the door? What are the challenges here? How can we dig into some of this stuff that's really critical? So understanding your key constituency, where your data is going, and then figuring out what are your key questions that you need to have answered in order to operate your organization. Is it demographic and is it outcome? It really is what we were saying before, and what Beth was giving that example of is you need to build that system so that you get better and better, but prioritizing the key elements of data that you need in order to drive your organization. I work with a lot of CBOs that work with young people, with teenagers. A lot of the data that's gathered is surveying, asking young people to reflect on their own experience. And, we all, as Marla was saying, have our own bias. Teenagers are classic. They are classic in terms of, if you do a pre-post test, survey with a teenager, they will rate themselves so high on that first day. They think they know everything. Then they spend 6, 8, 12 weeks with you and they realize, maybe I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And then their numbers will go down.
Much different, Julia, but
Right, but that doesn't mean that you actually weren't successful in your work with them. It just means that they got a clue because they're 16 years old.
Right.
So I spend a lot of time with groups trying to figure out, should you pre-test and post-test? Should you just post-test? Should you be doing that survey work anyway? Should you use a standardized test versus developing your own? And that's a whole nother big, long conversation. But it's very personalized. It's very specific to the organization, and it's very specific to the constituency that you're working with. So I'm sorry that was long-winded, but there's a lot there for people to have to deal with.
There's a lot there. Thank you for that. Beth, did you want to add anything?
No, I think she covered it.
Beth, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about when you have the results of measurement and impact evaluation, what decisions should they make? Should they inform from an organization's and or board's perspective? So how are you using the data to inform decisions for the org?
Well, I think in our case, our mission is to help people move out of poverty. It's to help them improve and gain economic mobility. And that's gaining is a measurement process. You know, you go from one place to another place. So inherent in that is gains. And our staff at the front lines who are doing the coaching need to know where people are starting vis-a-vis their lives in a number of ways, and where they want to be, the kinds of goals that they're setting, whether they're achieving those goals, and whether achieving those goals is helping them move ahead. And by that, I mean, move out of shelter and into permanent housing, get the kind of healthcare that they and their children need to stabilize their healthcare problems, save money, decrease their debts, improve their education and their skills, and get additional credentials, and move ahead in the job market and earn more money. So if you're in the business of creating movement in all those areas, which we are, the frontline staff who are doing the coaching need to measure for themselves, for their own work. They need to know where a participant is and where a participant has gotten over a period of time, whether the coaching and the work that they're doing with that participant is effective or not effective. And in the process of the data becoming inherent in the work, becoming a crucial part of the work for the participant, for the coach, then what happens is you end up having a very, very rich kind of culture that's used to looking and asking questions. Where am I? Where do I want to be? And am I getting there? Am I not? Is it warmer? Is it colder? And when you have that kind of work happening in the front lines, then what you can do is it can scroll up to help you understand both the relationship between the processes that you have going on and the outcomes that you're achieving, both shorter term and then longer term outcomes. So now as an organization, I not only know how much money our participants are earning more after 6 months, 10, 12 months, 18 months of coaching, what kind of income gains they're getting or education gains or debt reductions, but I know it from 145 organizations across the United States, and we can benchmark against each other, and we can use what's happening in one place to ask questions about why one place maybe it's working better than in another place. So you end up starting at the beginning with this very basic question of, where is my participant and where is my participant going? Have they traveled journey that's a positive journey, to having this big system-wide kind of data that allows you to ask much more sophisticated questions about what contributes to that kind of movement. And as an organization, are you doing better or worse than you were doing last year? We were able to ask lots of questions about the impacts of COVID and what they did to those starting places, and what they did to the kind of goal setting that our participants were able to do, and what it did to the kind of pathways they were created in relationship to prior years when COVID wasn't in place. And it gives you lots of ideas about whether new ways of coaching are working or not working. You end up having really, really rich tools as a leader to both shape your organization and refine its work, but also to keep your own staff involved and motivated as they can see what's happening with their own participants on the ground.
Yeah. I love one of the things you just said about, oh, sorry, Marla, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think what Beth is saying is also a little bit counterintuitive, and I just want to make sure that the point comes through, which is using the data to ask questions versus using the data as a definitive answer to a decision. And we often just have this bias and this point of view that the data-driven decision-making, we're a data organization, we track the data, we're data this. I hear that from every single client that I work with, no matter where they sit in the world or what they do in the world. But what Beth is saying is to also really use it to ask the right questions. And I just don't want that point to get lost because it is so important. Sometimes the data really is about how to innovate, how to ask the right question, as opposed to that rigorous decision making. So I just want to make sure that point wasn't lost because I think it's so important.
No, it's almost the most important, right? Because you have to make sure that this data is not just, it's helping inform how to be better, essentially, right? Like you're asking yourselves, yes, we're seeing movement here, but why? And then what can we do to both improve that or challenge any adverse effects? And sort of that was one of the things I was just going to say, which is that the data obviously can help fundraising efforts as well. And I'm sure all of you can speak to this. My 2 cents will just be that, right, to Beth's point, you know, you're seeing some movement, some gains, but you don't know why. So then you dig into that data a little bit further. You then discover that maybe your folks need, I don't know, a bicycle to get to work, whatever, made that up. Now you have a pitch, right, that you can now write a fundraising platform, campaign, grant around to increase your fundraising opportunity to further drive your outcomes. So that's sort of the tie back to the fundraising piece, one piece of it. Marla, certainly add on if you have anything else to add around the fundraising piece of it too.
No, I mean, I think it's the same thing. It really uncovers the what and the why and then the how. And it's answering all 3 of those questions as you describe it.
Exactly right. And I'm going to stay with you, Marla, if you don't mind, because I know, you know, you spoke when we had the prep conversation about sort of pitfalls in this area too, right? And sort of, I'd love from your perspective and expertise working with organizations, where do you see folks go wrong? What are some of the things where people sort of fall off the rails a little bit?
You know, I think it's a couple things. I think one is just swinging the pendulum too far, which we've all talked about in this conversation, is, you know, that metrics then you become a slave to the metrics, right? You just become that everything you do drives back to the metrics. And while you want that to be an input, you only want it to be one input. You really need the human side, the problem solving, the experience side of it. So that's one, is just swinging the pendulum a little too far. I think the other pitfall is, you know, not being explicit and having explicit conversations about what you're using the data for. And having the transparency and the recognition that we all have bias about the data. And for each one of us, we're going to grab onto that one metric that we like the best, that we think is just so important. And we just have to recognize that and put the processes and the systems in place to make sure that we're doing that. And then I think the other piece is, which, you know, Julia and Beth already touched on very importantly, is you have to communicate to the right stakeholder with the right metrics and the framing of those metrics. Because just the metrics in isolation, you leave this to people to figure it out. And I saw this happen even at Babson, where, you know, we would get some metrics and then I would observe the board like asking all these questions. And I'm like, okay, we're missing the point here. Like, we've lost the plot. That's not what we should be doing. Let's come back to the point of what the board should be discussing related to this metrics. And that is all just discipline. It's just meeting discipline. It's process discipline. It's having the right conversation with the right people at the right time, which is what we should be doing regardless of whether this is metrics or not, but it still is challenging to do.
For sure. Julia, I have one of the best questions I think we got from a registrant, because this was a question I asked myself at my prior job at Scholar Athletes all the time, which is, how can a nonprofit claim ownership of an outcome when there's so many other factors, right? Other nonprofits, the teachers, their home life, like, so where do you draw that line of saying, I changed that kid's grades, right? Like,
I was just going to say that, Becca. That's funny. She's only heard me say this a million times because so much of my work is with children, is that kids don't live in test tubes. They don't go home and go to sleep in their little pods and then they come back to your organization. So a big part of my work with groups is around alignment. So aligning the outcomes that you want to be able to claim some connection to, responsibility to, and making sure that that outcome, short-term outcome and long-term, and I'm glad that Beth brought up that there's a lot of variation there, really makes sense with who you're working with and what they're getting. And so, you know, I do a lot of work around with organizations, helping them develop their logic models or the theory of changes so they can really see if that alignment makes sense. But, you know, I do a lot of work in the youth arts field where there's amazing theater arts programs. I had some great opportunity to do some sports work with young people, but looking at what you're providing them with and thinking about the outcomes that you're trying to claim has to make sense. And if you're only seeing a young person for 2 to 4 hours a week, you cannot take responsibility for the fact that they graduated from high school. That is not alignment. It may be happening, and you could say that you're contributing towards that because they're more motivated to come to school on the days that they get to play at sports or they get to participate in an after-school theater program, but you can't say that you were responsible for them graduating from high school. But you can look at the research and show that there's been great research done to show the importance of sports in healthy youth development, that there's great connection between music education and math outcomes. You can reference other people's research and not have to do it yourself, then ensure that you're running a quality program, and then connect your outcomes to the fact that there's been research out there to prove it, and say that as a result of participating in a program, we are contributing towards this. And you can use some standardized or individualized tools around some critical social emotional learning skills that are connected to sports and to arts, such as self-confidence, perseverance, teamwork, all these great important skills that young people need. Those would be connected back to the curriculum and the approaches that you're using. But one of the biggest pitfalls, and this is back to Marla's point, is that you can find yourself making promises that you can't prove. And it's much better to carve out smaller, narrower definitions of outcomes that you really make sense with the way that your program is lined up. And again, back to another thing that Marla was talking about, which is using data to ask questions, being a learning organization and building learning into your culture. No funder is ever going to question your value if you demonstrate that you are learning and that you are seeking to improve. And somebody asked a question in the Q&A box before about funders because they need money. You got to tell your funders that you believe in data, you believe in learning, you believe in evaluation, and they have to fund it. People, it is one of the biggest pitfalls we find in the not-for-profit sector is this expectation now that we all should be doing this, but nobody wants to pay for it. And fundamentally, it's our responsibility to educate up to our funders to say, we believe in this stuff and you guys got to help us cover some of these costs, because good evaluation and good measurement is not free. And I'm setting Beth up for that one because she knows she invests, she has a huge, rich, incredible department that focuses on her data, that is a role model, but it's not cheap, right, Beth?
Not cheap, no, it's not.
Well, maybe the question specifically, because I love that you touched upon that, learning organizations are definitely ones that funders love to see because you're humble. You recognize that you don't know, you're learning as you go, right? You're evolving. But wondering, Beth, if you or anyone else can speak to what types of funders, who is actually funding this work? Because as I've said, a lot of our nonprofits out there don't have a ton of resources and would love to sort of pursue pathways for funding for this work.
Well, I think that there are different funders who are funding different aspects of the work. You know, there are places like the Fidelity Foundation and others who are very, very interested in funding technological development that allows you to do this kind of work. So supporting the development of technology platforms. There are other organizations that are willing to support, you know, training aspects of your staff. So those are pieces of it. But I think that the most important thing is to understand that data is not there primarily to be a tool for judgment. You know, funders, government, others become fearful of data and fearful of having a data culture because they feel as though, oh, it's going to be used to judge me, thumbs up or thumbs down. And when you shift to being an organization that really likes to use data to ask questions and likes to have everybody asking those questions, it becomes more about what Julie was talking about being a learning culture. And then as you become a learning culture and you're doing this kind of work, we as an organization have been able to grow the data as a revenue generator for us, quite frankly, or as a self-funded cost. So when we go out and we do coaching contracts with other organizations, or even in our own work when we're contracting with the state or with others, the costs of that research and evaluation are actually built into our overhead costs. It's something that that gets just is like your human services, your human resources department or your finance department, it becomes something that's part of what you're doing, and because of that becomes part of your G&A. And over time you can build that in, and you can also in our cases, when you're helping other organizations build up these kind of coaching practices, the research and evaluation components of that are something that are built into that process as well. So there are funders who will fund the one-offs, but what you're looking, the one-offs of building of a technology platform or a training process, but what you're really looking for is the ongoing financial resources to allow you to sustain the work. And that happens when it's hardwired into the contractual stuff that you're doing or into your basic administrative overhead.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just to hammer that home, I'm seeing definitely when people launch campaigns or even in grants that come in here, people are carving out sections of the grant just to not maybe necessarily go to the people or programming, but to actually do the research and evaluation of the impact. And so it's sort of this unrestricted bucket of the grant that's going to go towards this such imperative work, really.
I just want to add one thing real quickly, is that one of the things I've been finding recently with community-based organizations is I really urge them to find a staff person who's going to own this data internally. So even as you're beginning to do the culture work that Beth and Marla are talking about, there's somebody who owns sort of the cleaning of the data, the organizing the data. I, of course, am always advocating, call them a data coordinator, get them in there. And the smart EDs who push back on me are like, Julia, we can't afford that. But somebody I worked with recently did a new position sort of at a coordinator level where they combine the role with development. So it was a half development and data position. And, development loves data. Development can't do their job without good data to incorporate into their grants. And it was a great way for her to be able to justify the costs. She needed somebody else to help out her director of development. I really was pushing her on her data gathering. This young woman has been amazing, and has served both these functions and made it more cost effective and built it in, just like Beth was talking about. So that's something that people can think about as they're envisioning adding a staff role, is looking at the way that the different functions can get integrated and combined.
Mm-hmm. One of the other pitfalls, Becca, I'll just add is, and also I think it's really incumbent upon boards in particular to educate themselves, is around data taxonomy, right? Is it zero-party data that your customers are offering to you? Is it first-party data, which you're capturing just because they exist within your organization? Second, third, is it coming from other organizations? And within that taxonomy, also really understanding privacy and security. Because I don't think anyone is immune to having some sort of a breach or having a customer or a donor get upset about the way in which their data was used. And I think that's particularly challenging in nonprofits due to the resourcing constraints that, Julia and Beth have mentioned. But I would really just make sure that boards and others are really educated on, how you need to treat these different types of data. And what are those security and privacy watchouts or concerns that you just need to be aware of to make sure that, something doesn't happen that turns out to negatively impact all the efforts that are being put in place.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that came in from a participant is interesting, which is, we talked a lot about sort of the easy things to measure, like is the kid showing up, participation, right? Are they going from point A to point B? What about the more subjective things like advocacy? Like, capacity building, community organizing. How would you recommend an organization measures that? Not sure who wants to take that.
Well, I'll just dive in and say, we have an advocacy department, and we do set goals for our advocacy, and we measure whether we're achieving those goals. And it's really hard to be effective at setting those kinds of goals. But I think what is commonly done is measuring participation of community voices, the connection to, and so if you're organizing, how many people are you organizing? How many times did they show up? What kind of recommendations, or how many recommendations or ideas of what types came out of that organizing? We also measure things like we expected to have a certain number of testimony, a certain amount of testimony that's given, or a certain amount of bills that we're working on that are moving forward and hitting certain stages. So we'll measure things that are process related things and involvement and participation related things. And then hopefully you're also measuring, did you achieve the ultimate goals that you want, which in our case would be things like raising the wage cap for eligibility for TANF. So did that or did that not pass? And we'll have these goals that we set for ourselves that ultimately say, did we hopefully did we move the ball down the field the way we wanted to?
Well, another question, I'm not sure, Julie, I'm going to go to you with this one that came in. I totally get it, right? If you only have sort of time with the kid and access to maybe their grade, how do you measure academic outcomes in that? Like, what would you recommend in terms of that?
I mean, so much of this is around partnerships. I do a lot of work with the Boston Public Schools and with organizations that partner with BPS, and you need to work out relationships. And back to Marla's point about privacy issues, if you want to be able to say that you're working directly with young people and are supporting their academic achievement, then you need to work through the requirements of privacy and access through your school partners to make sure that BPS has done an amazing job of developing a really strong research and evaluation department now, and is seeking to partner in the best way with community-based organizations that are also working towards their same goals, but they're also very careful about the privacy of the young people in their school system, as they should be. And so you have to go through many different paperwork systems in order to have access to their data and around education and grades. So, but ultimately, if you're working in a class, but you want to be able to track individuals, you're going to have to figure out how you get access to that young person's grades. And the best way to do that is through the partnerships that you're developing with your school system. You're not going to get it on a one-on-one as a community-based organization unless you're working effectively with your partners. So partnership is key to this. Staying back to Marla's point originally around transparency, we need to, look each other in the eye and say, we all want to work together towards these outcomes, and we have to be able to figure out what's the right way to share data so that we can make sure we're all on the same page and moving in the same direction.
Yep. Another question that had come in prior to the event from a registrant was around, it's very technical, but what have you seen as the best CRM, the best software that nonprofits are using to collect data? What do you recommend? And think about ones that have resources and ones that don't. What would you recommend?
Right. So first of all, I think I am a big fan of Excel, and Excel is a more able to do more things than most people think about it able to do. I've also transitioned more and more to Google products now. I'm not advertising here. I'm just telling you the truth. And I am not a huge fan of Google Forms, but you know what? They're free. And once you get good on them, you can use them in place of other survey modules. I do use a paid survey product that I bought 20 years ago that I'm really good on, because I do a lot of survey design work and it doesn't cost a whole lot of money. I'm not going to advertise that here, but if anybody wants to know, I'm happy to tell them about it. Anybody who knows me knows what I use. But I've been using Google Forms more, and folks have figured out how to use them, and they dump right into Excel, and they're really easy to use. More and more of the youth serving organizations in the greater Boston area are using Salesforce. Salesforce has its strengths and its limitations. I'd be interested to hear what they're using at EMPath now, because I know what they were using before, but I know that you guys have been through a couple of different platforms over the years. And it's all about right sizing, back to where we started, which is if you're small and you don't have a whole lot of resources, do not spend a lot of money on an expensive CRM. If you can find a good funding source out there, and I see the questions about looking for funders, but I hate to write them in the chat because I don't necessarily know exactly how funders guidelines have changed. So I'm happy to answer questions offline with folks about some of the funders that I know have recently funded some of these projects, but are interested in capacity building, are interested in infrastructure, and would help underwrite the cost of a new system. But realistically, looking at your data and looking at your organization's operating budget, you have to think about how much money you can invest in this. And so, Google Forms are free. And Google Sheets are pretty powerful. So,
and I'm a big I agree with Julia, and I'm a big proponent of Google Analytics. Google Analytics is another tool that's wonderful, that accepts data from a variety of different sources, and you can develop really pretty easily pages that allow you to have regular dashboards and report generation that multiple people can use and can be used, and so it's very, very useful that way. I think a lot of organizations are required by their funding sources to use ETO, a lot of efforts to outcomes, a lot of government funded, government contract, human service organizations are required to submit to the state, or in some cases to the city, in efforts to outcomes. And I would say that that system is still broadly used, and we find that being used with our partners across the United States. It has a whole bunch of drawbacks, and what's especially difficult is that usually at any state or local level, they've tailored it in ways that make it so that it isn't standardized across organizations. So, but what we always try to do is we try to work with the systems that our partners already have, and ETO is available because you don't want to be bringing in layers and layers of software systems to try to get at data, and usually that requires multiple inputting, and that's duplicative and cumbersome, and then people don't do it. We use Apricot. It is a social solutions product, and we use it for both ourselves, and also many of our partners are now directly inputting into Apricot with us. And it has its own drawbacks too. I think any system will, but we are also seeing a lot of those social solutions products being used out there, and we migrated to Apricot from ETO because it was had better report generation capabilities and analytic capabilities than the prior systems did.
Marla, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything about what you've seen. No need. We've had two. Yeah. So one of the questions I actually meant to ask this a few minutes ago, but it's more of a subjective question, might be a little bit difficult to answer, but I think, Beth, you were speaking about how building a culture that supports data, that builds a learning environment within the organization is critical. I think what's so important is that you don't build a culture where you can't fail. And by fail, I mean not hit an outcome, not hit a metric, right? Because then people, worst case scenario, you start fudging data, you start fearing that, oh, my numbers aren't going up every single quarter or whatever. So I guess if someone could speak to maybe, Beth, just making sure that you can build a culture of learning and not instilling in your staff members who might be tracking the data on a daily basis, that it's okay if we don't hit, a target potentially, right? And so, I don't know, just speak to both the importance of and how you set that culture within an organization.
Well, I think the first thing that's important is to not have top-down generation of goals and targets. You don't want to have the leaders of the organization saying you should graduate 20 people this year. And then people fall short and they feel like they've been set up for failure, or they're going to be judged if they fall short because this is the target they've been given. I think it's really, really important to have frontline staff involved in setting the targets around their own work. What do they want to achieve? What do they think they can achieve? And asking questions like, what would it take to help us achieve? Everybody wants to achieve more in human services. They want to do better. And so the question is getting frontline staff to have ideas about how to get better, and in setting their own targets, if they didn't reach their own targets, to ask and have them regularly asked, okay, why was it the target wasn't reached? It's what you said you wanted to do. We know that you're highly motivated. Why do you think it didn't happen? And trying to then get at the sort of iteration that allows you as a learning organization to get better. So the culture, what really helps with that is having the frontline staff involved in the setting of the goals of the organization, and for their own work in particular. And then having a regular interface between your research staff or whomever with those staff to talk about how things are going and why they think things are going great or not going great. And maybe there are other departments where things are happening differently that you can compare to, and they can share and learn from each other. So it becomes this constant kind of muscle memory of what are we doing and why did it work? Why did it not work? As opposed to, you did it wrong, you're failing. Why didn't you hit this? I don't care why you didn't hit it. It means that you're on probation. It's just a very, very, very different kind of culture when you're involving staff at all levels in asking those kind of questions.
That's so important.
Along those lines too, Becca, I just, in even observing our conversation here, there's a big difference between a target, a metric, a data point, etc. And really from a cultural standpoint, getting clear with everyone, as Beth is describing, on this is an aspirational target that we hope to achieve. These are the metrics and the KPIs that are going to help us get there. This is the data that is going to help us learn. This is going to be, and that taxonomy is really, really important. And we've even in our conversation been using data and metrics interchangeably. And really it's not. And a KPI is a key performance indicator that is often used in for-profits, but sometimes in not-for-profits. But you really need to be clear on the data. What is a metric? What are you being held accountable for versus what's aspirational? What is going to inform decision making? And so I just really encourage people to think through and use this as a working session, because this together will help set the culture that you want to have by everyone having the shared grounding of what's a metric, what's a data, when do we do this, when do we do that? Mm-hmm. Because think about all of us. I mean, a metric means something different to me than it means to Beth and Julia, and to you, Becca, too, in all of our jobs. So we use that word and we throw it around and we think we know what we're talking about, but we don't have shared understanding.
Right. And I think that's a really, and Becca and I encountered this a lot in our work, which is one of the things that happens a lot in the human service not-for-profit sector is that our board members often come from business.
Yeah.
And business people think in numbers differently than the human service sector. So Becca and I, when we work together, we're always kind of saying KPIs. I was like, and I never dealt with KPIs until I was working with Skull Athletes, because we had this board of people who thought in measurement. And one of the things that I was able to do, and it's nice as an outsider, and you can't really do this as if you're an insider, is being able to push back against board and saying, this is not a realistic number. Let me set some context for you in terms of the field writ large. And let's think realistically about what are the right measures that can inform your process, that can let you as a board go out and do the work you need to do, but then also empowers your staff to be the best that they can be, as Beth was talking about. And so I really couldn't agree more with what both Marla and Beth are saying around that, but it is an inherent challenge in our field, which is that sometimes boards know a lot less about our clients and our data than we do. And yet they're looking for different kind of numbers and they use different words, exactly what Marla is saying. And so metrics and performance, right? So there's a lot of that. So
they need to take that upon themselves too. I mean, you should not be, on a board if you're not willing to educate yourself about the industry and the customer and the value creation and all of those pieces of it too. Right.
So, but sometimes it's really hard. And one of the projects that Becca and I once worked on together was around having to say to a board member sometimes, we're going to change the target population of this organization and we're going to see worse outcomes because there are kids in need that are not being served right now. And if we change our focus from the high-performing young people to more in need young people, but who can really benefit from what we have to do, we are uniquely positioned. It's going to be incredibly powerful, and our KPIs are going to look worse for a short term. But that doesn't mean we're not doing what we should be doing, board. We need you to get behind us. But that's hard stuff, and I don't want to underestimate the power of that kind of shift too.
No, that is definitely difficult to communicate within an organization, and certainly easier when you have an external consultant to help share and validate that statement. But I love, Beth, what you were saying, how important it is to have staff involved in the creation, not only because it's them that really knows firsthand what's happening and who you're serving, but now they're bought in, right? Like they feel like they were part of the voice that created this goal, and now they can help get there. So we only have a couple minutes left. I did want to open the floor if anybody had any closing thoughts, final sort of things for folks to think about that are out there listening right now. We did have a question just come in.
About qualitative data.
Yeah, I think Beth hit on this. Go ahead, Julie, if you want.
Well, I'm a big fan of qualitative data. What I always say to folks, again, from small community-based organizations perspective, the strongest evaluations have both. You should have some quantitative measures and some qualitative measures. Qualitative measures of like focus groups and interviews and quotes tell a story, and they're very powerful and they're very valuable. And when I was in grad school, at the Heller School of Brandeis, we were taught qualitative data is just as rigorous as quantitative. You just have to do it really well. So in a short answer, yes, you should use qualitative data, but make sure you're doing it in the most rigorous way you can and augment it as much as possible if you can have quantitative measures.
If you guys can see in the chat, someone did make reference to the Boston After School and Beyond, I believe. I think that was the acronym was ACT, if I'm remembering it. And they were saying, are there any other prisons out there? And someone recommended this WIT one, I think, which I'm not familiar with, but weren't sure if anybody else had any other recommendations for sort of capturing youth wellness. But we can put those in the chat as I sort of close up shop here, because we do have a raffle to get through. Very exciting for folks that have lasted with us from 10 o'clock to 10:55. You are eligible for a raffle. I'll call the names. My team just texted me the 3 winners. you will be winning a VIP gift box from the Red Sox Foundation from one of our recent events. It has, I'm looking at it right now, it has wine, amazing. Lots of sort of skincare, hair care, free facial, some Red Sox swag, pretty cool bag. But I did want to just close with some final thoughts and appreciation, mostly for our guests that joined us this morning, for taking an hour out of your time to share your expertise, your thoughts, and just your brain power for the 113 folks that are out there right now listening. Incredibly valuable in ways that you will never know. So thank you so much. Some of the things that I know I will take with me going forward, not having this top-down generation of metrics, some of the pitfalls, promising what you can't prove, making sure that you're a learning organization and that data is not a tool of judgment. I think lastly, I'll close with Julia's great quote, measure what you value and others will value what you measure. So really great points, nuggets of knowledge that hopefully folks will take with them as they move forward with their organizations. Last but not least, the three winners out there right now, Alexa St. Fort Canton, Lily Mendez, and Samantha Lawson. You three will be emailed by, yes, congratulations. You three will be emailed by a member of our team for your addresses, and we'll mail you those gift boxes shortly. Last but not least, as always, when you click leave, you will be asked to complete a survey. It is super quick, literally like 30 seconds. Please, please, please take the 30 seconds, complete it. As I mentioned at the intro, the information you put in that survey will help inform the next conversation. If you missed it, what I love about WIN is that every conversation is driven by you, our participants, and our members. You tell us, we get the experts, we bring them together, and then we have a great conversation. And so filling out that survey will help inform our next convening, which will likely be Q1 of FY22. And hopefully at some point next year, like I said, we can meet in person. It would be great to gather here at Fenway Park again. But if not, we'll have this on Zoom and we will share the results of that survey very soon. Thank you again to our panelists. Everybody out there, enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you. Happy holidays. Can't believe we're already here. And happy end of the year. And we will see you in 2022. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your morning. Take care.